Chapter 10. The Duchess and the Devil. Acting Lieutenant Hornblower was bringing the sloop La Rêve, prize of HMS Indefatigable, to anchor in Gibraltar Bay. He was nervous. If anyone had asked him if he thought that all the telescopes in the Mediterranean fleet were trained upon him, he would have laughed at the fantastic suggestion, but he felt as if they were. Nobody ever gauged more cautiously the strength of the gentle following breeze, or estimated more anxiously the distances between the big anchored ships of the line, or calculated more carefully the space La Rêve would need to swing at her anchor. Jackson, his petty officer, was standing forward, awaiting the order to take in the jib, and he acted quickly at Hornblower's hail. "Helm a lee," said Hornblower next, and La Rêve rounded into the wind. "Brail up!" La Rêve crept forward, her momentum diminishing as the wind took her way off her. "Let go!" The cable growled a protest as the anchor took it out through the hawse-hole. That welcome splash of the anchor, telling of the journey's end. Hornblower watched carefully while La Rêve took up on her cable and then relaxed a little. He had brought the prize safely in. The Commodore, Captain Sir Edward Pellew of HMS Indefatigable, had clearly not yet returned, so that it was Hornblower's duty to report to the Port Admiral. "Get the boat hoisted out," he ordered, and then, remembering his humanitarian duty, "and you can let the prisoners up on deck." They had been battened down below for the last 48 hours, because the fear of a recapture was the nightmare of every prize master. But here, in the bay with the Mediterranean fleet all round, that danger was at an end. 2 hands of the oars of the gig sent her skimming over the water, and in 10 minutes Hornblower was reporting his arrival to the Admiral. "You say she shows a fair turn of speed," said the latter, looking over at the prize. "Yes, sir, and she's handy enough," said Hornblower. I'll purchase her into the service." "Never enough dispatch vessels," mused the Admiral. Even with that hint, it was a pleasant surprise to Hornblower when he received heavily sealed official orders and, opening them, read that "You are hereby requested and required to take H.M. sloop La Rêve under his command and to proceed with the utmost expedition to Plymouth as soon as the dispatches destined for England should be put in his charge." It was an independent command. It was a chance of seeing England again. It was 3 years since Hornblower had last set foot on English shore, and it was a high professional compliment. But there was another letter, delivered at the same moment, which Hornblower read with less elation. "Their Excellencies, Major General Sir Hugh and Lady Dalrymple, request the presence of Acting Lieutenant Horatio Hornblower's company at dinner today at 3 o'clock at Government House." It might be a pleasure to dine with the Governor of Gibraltar and his lady, but it was only a mixed pleasure at best for an acting lieutenant with a single sea chest, faced with the need to dress himself suitably for such a function. Yet it was hardly possible for a young man to walk up to Government House from the landing ship without a thrill of excitement, especially as his friend, Mr. Midshipman Bracegirdle, who came from a wealthy family and had a handsome allowance, had lent him a pair of the finest white stockings of China silk. Bracegirdle's calves were plump, and Hornblower's were skinny, but that difficulty had been artistically circumvented. 2 small pads of oakum, some strips of sticking plaster from the surgeon's stores, and Hornblower now had a couple of legs with which no one need be ashamed. He could put his left leg forward to make his bow without any fear of wrinkles in his stockings, and sublimely conscious, as Bracegirdle said, of a leg of which any gentleman would be proud. At Government House, the usual polished and languid aide-de-camp took charge of Hornblower and led him forward. He made his bow to Sir Hugh, a red-faced and fussy old gentleman, and to Lady Dalrymple, a red-faced and fussy old lady. "Mr. Hornblower," said the latter, "I must present you, Your Grace, this is Mr. Hornblower, the new captain of La Rêve, Her Grace the Duchess of Wharfdale." A duchess, no less! Hornblower poked forward his padded leg, pointed his toe, laid his hand on his heart, and bowed with all the depths that tightness of his breeches allowed. He had still been growing when he bought them on joining the Indefatigable. Bold, blue eyes, and a once beautiful middle-aged face. "So this is the fellow in question," said the Duchess. "Matilda, my dear, Are you going to hentrust me to a hinfant in harms?" The startling vulgarity of the accent took Hornblower's breath away. He had been ready for almost anything except that a superbly dressed Duchess should speak in the accent of the Seven Dials. He raised his eyes to stare, while forgetting to straighten himself up, standing with his chin poked forward and his hand still on his heart. "You look like a gander on a green," said the Duchess. "I expects you to hiss any moment." She stuck her own chin out and swung from side to side with her hands on her knees in a perfect imitation of a belligerent goose, apparently with so close a resemblance to Hornblower as well as to excite a roar of laughter from the other guests. Hornblower stood in blushing confusion. "Don't be hard on the young fella," says the Duchess, coming to his defence and patting him on the shoulder. "He's only a young un, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Something to be proud of, for that matter, to be trusted with a ship at that age." It was lucky that the announcement of dinner came to save Hornblower from the further confusion into which this kindly remark had thrown him. Hornblower naturally found himself with the riffraff, the ragtag and bobtail of the middle of the table, along with the other junior officers. Sir Hugh sat at one end with the Duchess, while Lady Dalrymple sat with the Commodore at the other. Moreover, there were not nearly as many women as men. That was only to be expected, as Gibraltar was, technically at least, a beleaguered fortress. So, Hornblower had no woman on either side of him. At his right sat the young aide-de-camp who had first taken him in charge. "Your health, your Grace, your health," said the Commodore, looking down the length of the table and raising his glass. "Thank'ee," replied the Duchess. "Just in time to save me life. I was wondering who'd come to my rescue." She raised her brimming glass to her lips, and when she put it down again it was empty. "A jolly boon companion you're going to have," said the aide-de-camp to Hornblower. "How is she going to be my companion?" asked Hornblower, quite bewildered. The aide-de-camp looked at him pityingly. "So you have not been informed?" he asked. As always, the man most concerned is the last to know. "When you sail with your dispatches tomorrow, you will have the honour of bearing Her Grace with you to England." "Oh, God bless my soul," said Hornblower. "Let's hope he does," said the aide-de-camp piously, nosing his wine. "Poor stuff this sweet Malaga is. Old Hare brought a job lot in '95, and every governor since then seems to think that it's his duty to use it up." "But who is she?" asked Hornblower. "Her Grace the Duchess of Wharfdale," replied the aide-de-camp. "Did you not hear Lady Dalrymple introduce her?" "But she doesn't talk like a duchess," protested Hornblower. "No, the old Duke was in his dotage when he married her. She was an innkeeper's widow, so her friends say. You can imagine, if you like, what her enemies say." "Yeah, but what is she doing here?" went on Hornblower. "She is on her way back to England. She was at Florence when the French marched in, I understand. She reached Leghorn, and bribed a coaster to bring her here. She asked Sir Hugh to find her a passage, and Sir Hugh asked the Admiral. Sir Hugh would ask anyone for anything on behalf of a duchess, even one said by her friends to be an innkeeper's widow." "I see," said Hornblower. There was a burst of merriment from the head of the table, and the Duchess was prodding the governor's scarlet-coated ribs with the handle of her knife, as if to make sure he saw the joke. "Maybe you will not lack for mirth on your homeward voyage," said the aide-de-camp. Just then, a smoking sirloin of beef was put down in front of Hornblower, and all his other worries vanished before the necessity of carving it, and remembering his manners. He took the carving knife and fork gingerly in his hands, and glanced round at the company. "May I help you to some of this beef, your Grace? Madam, sir. Well done or underdone, sir? A little of the brown fat?" In the hot room the sweat ran down his face as he wrestled with the joint. He was fortunate that most of the guests desired helpings from the other, removed so that he had little carving to do. He put a couple of haggled slices onto his own plate as the simplest way of concealing the worst results of his own handiwork. "Beef from Tetuan," sniffed the aide-de-camp. "Tough and stringy." That was all very well for a governor's aide-de-camp. He could not guess how delicious was this food to a young naval officer, fresh from beating about at sea in an overcrowded frigate. Even the thought of having to act as a host to a duchess could not entirely spoil Hornblower's appetite. And the final dishes, the meringues and macaroons, The custards and the fruits were ecstasy for a young man whose last pudding had been currant duff last Sunday. "Those sweet things spoil a man's palate," said the aide-de-camp. Much Hornblower cared. They were drinking formal toasts now. Hornblower stood for the king and the royal family, and raised his glass for the Duchess. "Now for the enemy," said Sir Hugh. "May their treasure galleons try to cross the Atlantic." "A supplement to that, Sir Hugh," said the Commodore at the other end. "May the Dons make up their minds to leave Cadiz." There was a growl almost like wild animals from round the table. Most of the naval officers present were from Jervis's Mediterranean squadron, which had been beaten about in the Atlantic for the past several months, hoping to catch the Spaniards should they come out. Jervis had to detach his ships to Gibraltar 2 at a time to replenish their stores, and these officers were from the 2 ships of the line present at the moment in Gibraltar. "Johnny Jervis would say amen to that," said Sir Hugh. "A bumper to the Dons then, gentlemen, and may they come out from Cadiz." The ladies left them, gathered together by Lady Dalrymple, and as soon as it was decently possible, Hornblower made his excuses and slipped away, determined not to be heavy with wine the night before he sailed in independent command. Maybe the prospect of the coming on board of the Duchess was a useful counter-irritant, and saved Hornblower from worrying too much about his first command. He was up before dawn, before even the brief Mediterranean twilight had begun, to see that his precious ship was in condition to face the sea, and the enemies who swarmed upon the sea. He had 4 pop-gun 4-pounders to deal with those enemies, which meant that he was safe from no one. His was the weakest vessel at sea, for the smallest trading brig carried a more powerful armament. So that, like all weak creatures, his only safety lay in flight. Hornblower looked aloft in the half-light, where the sails would be set on which so much might depend. He went over the watch bill with his 2 watch-keeping officers, Midshipman Hunter and Master's Mate Wynyard, to make sure that every man of his crew of 11 knew his duty. Then all that remained was to put on his smartest sea-going uniform, try to eat breakfast, and wait for the Duchess. She came early, fortunately. Their Excellencies has had to rise at a most unpleasant hour to see her off. Mr. Hunter reported the approach of the Governor's launch with suppressed excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Hunter," said Hornblower coldly. That was what the service demanded, even though not so many weeks before they had been playing Follow My Leader through the Indefatigable's rigging together. The launch swirled alongside, and 2 neatly dressed seamen hooked on the ladder. Le Rêve had such a small freeboard that boarding her presented no problem, even for ladies. The Governor stepped on board to the twittering of the only 2 pipes Le Rêve could muster, and Lady Dalrymple followed him. Then came the Duchess, and the Duchess's companion. The latter was a younger woman, as beautiful as the Duchess must once have been. A couple of aides-de-camp followed, and by that time the minute deck of Le Rêve was positively crowded, so that there was no room left to bring up the Duchess's baggage. "Let us show you to your quarters, Your Grace," said the Governor. Lady Dalrymple squawked her sympathy at the sight of the minute cabin, which the 2 cots almost filled, and everyone's head, inevitably, bumped against the deck beam above. "We shall live through it," said the Duchess stoically, "and that's more than many a man making a little trip to Tyburn could say." One of the aides-de-camp produced a last-minute packet of dispatches and demanded Hornblower's signature on the receipt. The last farewells were said, and Sir Hugh and Lady Dalrymple went down the side again to the twittering of the pipes. "Man the windlass!" bellowed Hornblower, the moment the launch's crew bent to their oars. A few seconds' lusty work brought Le Rêve up to her anchor. "Anchor's away, sir," reported Wynyard. "Jib halyards!" shouted Hornblower. "Mainsail halyards!" Le Rêve came round before the wind as her sails were set and her rudder took a grip on the water. Everyone was so busy catting the anchor and setting sail that it was Hornblower himself who dipped his colours in salute as Le Rêve crept out beyond the mole before the gentle sou'easter and dipped her nose to the first of the big Atlantic rollers coming in through the gut. Through the skylight beside him he heard a clatter and a wail as something fell in the cabin with that first roll, but he could spare no attention for the woman below. He had his glass upon his eye now, training it first on Algeciras and then upon Tarifa. Some well-manned privateer or ship of war might easily dash out to snap up such a defenceless prey as Le Rêve. He could not relax while the forenoon watch wore on. They rounded Cape Maraqui, and he set a course for St. Vincent, and then the mountains of southern Spain began to sink below the horizon. Cape Trafalgar was just visible on the starboard bow when at last he shut the telescope and began to wonder about dinner. It was pleasant to be captain of his own ship and to be able to order dinner when he chose. His aching legs told him that he'd been on his feet too long, 11 continuous hours. If the future brought him many independent commands, he would wear himself out by this sort of behaviour. Down below, he relaxed gratefully on the locker, and sent the cook to knock at the Duchess's cabin door to ask with his compliments if all was well. He heard the Duchess's sharp voice saying that they needed nothing, not even dinner. Hornblower philosophically shrugged his shoulders and ate his dinner with a young man's appetite. He went on deck again as night closed in upon them. Wynyard had the watch. "It's coming up thick, sir," he said. So it was. The sun was invisible on the horizon, engulfed in watery mist. It was the price he had to pay for a fair wind, he knew. In the winter months in these latitudes there was always likely to be a fog where the cool land breeze reached the Atlantic. It'll be thicker still by morning, he said gloomily, and revised his night orders, setting a course due west instead of west by north as he originally intended. He wanted to make certain of keeping clear of Cape St. Vincent in the event of fog. That was one of those minute trifles which may affect a man's whole afterlife. Hornblower had plenty of time later to reflect on what might have happened had he not ordered that alteration of course. During the night he was often on deck, peering through the increasing mist, but at the time when the crisis came, he was down below snatching a little sleep. What woke him was a seaman shaking his shoulder violently. "Please, sir, please, Mr. Hunter sent me. Please, sir, won't you come on deck, he says, sir." "I'll come," said Hornblower, blinking himself awake and rolling out of his cot. The faintest beginnings of dawn were imparting some slight luminosity to the mist which was close about them. La Rêve was lurching over an ugly sea with barely enough wind behind her to give her steerage way. Hunter was standing with his back to the wheel in an attitude of tense anxiety. "Listen," he said, as Hornblower appeared. He half whispered the word, and in his excitement he omitted the "sir" which was due to his captain, and in his excitement Hornblower did not notice the omission. Hornblower listened. He heard the shipboard noises he could expect, the clattering of the blocks as La Rêve lurched, the sound of the sea at her bows. But then he heard other shipboard noises. There were other blocks clattering. The sea was breaking beneath other bows. "There's a ship close alongside," said Hornblower. "Yes, sir, and after I sent below for you, I heard an order given, and it was in Spanish, some foreign tongue anyway." The tenseness of fear was all about the little ship like the fog. "Call all hands, and quietly," said Hornblower. But as he gave the order, he wondered if it would be of any use. He could send his men to their stations. He could man and load his 4-pounders, but if that ship out there in the fog was of any force greater than a merchant ship, he was in deadly peril. Then he tried to comfort himself. Perhaps the ship was some fat Spanish galleon bulging with treasure, and were he to board her, boldly, she would become his prize and make him rich for life. "Happy Valentine's Day to you," said a voice behind him, and he nearly jumped out of his skin with surprise. He had actually forgotten the presence of the Duchess aboard. "Stop that row!" he whispered furiously at her, and she pulled up abruptly in astonishment. She was bundled up in a cloak and hood against the damp air, and no further detail could be seen of her in the darkness and the fog. "May I ask—" "Shut up!" whispered Hornblower. A harsh voice could be heard through the fog. Other voices repeating the order, whistles being blown, much noise and bustle. "That's Spanish, sir, isn't it?" whispered Hunter. "Spanish for certain. Calling the watch. Listen!" The 2 double strokes of a ship's bell came to them across the water. 4 bells in the morning watch, and instantly from all round them a dozen other bells could be heard, as if echoing the first. "We're in the middle of a fleet, by God!" whispered Hunter. "Big ships too, sir," supplemented Wynyard, who had joined them with the callings of all hands. "I could hear half a dozen different pipes when they called the watch." "The Dons are out there, then," said Hunter, "and the course I set has taken us into the midst of them," thought Hornblower bitterly. The coincidence was maddening, heartbreaking, but he forbore to waste breath over it. He even suppressed the frantic jibe that rose to his lips at the memory of Sir Hugh's toast about the Spaniards coming out from Cadiz. "They're setting more sail," was what he said. "Day goes snug down at night just like some fat Indiaman. They only set the t'gallants at daybreak." All around them through the fog could be heard the whine of sheaves in blocks, the stamp and go of the men at the halyards, the sound of ropes being thrown on the decks, and the chatter of a myriad voices. "Oh, they make enough noise about it, blast 'em," said Hunter. The tension under which he laboured was apparent as he stood straining to peer through the mist. "Please God they're on a different course to us," said Wynyard more sensibly. "Then we'll soon be through 'em." "Not likely," said Hornblower. The Rev was running almost directly before what little wind there was. If the Spaniards were beating across it, or had it on their beam, they would be crossing her course at a considerable angle, so that the volume of sound from the nearest ship would have diminished or increased considerably in this time, and there was no indication of that whatever. It was far more likely that the Rev had overhauled the Spanish fleet under its nightly short canvas, and had sailed forward into the middle of it. It was a problem what to do next in that case, to shorten sail, or to heave to, and let the Spaniards get ahead of them again, or to clap on sail to pass through. But the passage of the minutes brought clear proof that fleet and sloop were on practically the same course, as otherwise they could hardly fail to pass some ship close by. As long as the mist held, they were safest as they were. But that was hardly to be expected with the coming of day. "Can't we alter course, sir?" asked Wynyard. "Wait," said Hornblower. In the faint growing light he had seen shreds of denser mist blowing past them, a clear indication that they could not hope for continuous fog. At that moment they ran out of a fog bank into a clear patch of water. "There she is, by God!" said Hunter. Both officers and seamen began to move about in sudden panic. "Stand still, damn you!" rasped Hornblower, his nervous tension releasing itself in the fierce monosyllables. Less than a cable's length away, a 3-deck ship of the line was standing along parallel to them on their starboard side. Ahead and on the port side could be seen the outlines, still shadowy, of other battleships. Nothing could save them if they drew attention to themselves. All that could be done was to keep going as if they had as much right to be there as the ships of the line. It was possible that in the happy-go-lucky Spanish Navy, the officer of the watch over there did not know that no sloop like La Rev was attached to the fleet, or even possibly by a miracle there might be one. La Rev was French-built and French-rigged after all. Side by side La Rev and the battleship sailed over the lumpy sea. They were within point-blank range of 50 big guns, when one well-aimed shot would sink them. Hunter was uttering filthy curses under his breath, but discipline had asserted itself. A telescope over there on the Spaniard's deck would not discover any suspicious bustle on board the sloop. Another shred of fog drifted past them, and then they were deep in a fresh fog bank. "Oh, thank God," said Hunter, indifferent to the contrast between this present piety and his preceding blasphemy. "Hands weigh ship," said Hornblower. "Lay her on the port tack." There was no need to tell the hands to do it quietly. They were as well aware of their danger as anyone. La Rev silently rounded to. The sheets were hauled in and coiled down without a sound, and the sloop, as close to the wind as she would lie, heeled to the small wind, meeting the lumpy waves with her port bow. "We'll be crossing their course now," said Hornblower. "And please God it'll be under their sterns and not their bows," said Wynyard. There was the Duchess, still in her cloak and hood, standing right aft as much out of the way as possible. "Don't you think your Grace had better go below?" asked Hornblower, making use by great effort of the formal form of address. "Oh no, please," said the Duchess. "I couldn't bear it." Hornblower shrugged his shoulders, and promptly forgot the Duchess's presence again as a new anxiety struck him. He dived below and came up again with the 2 big sealed envelopes of dispatches. He took a belaying pin from the rail and began to very carefully tie the envelopes to the pin with a bit of line. "Please," said the Duchess, Please, Mr. Hornblower, tell me what you're doing." "I want to make sure these will sink when I throw them overboard if we're captured," said Hornblower grimly. "Well, then they'll be lost for good." "Better that than the Spanish should read them," said Hornblower, with all the patience he could muster. "I could look after them for you," said the Duchess. "Indeed I could." Hornblower looked keenly at her. "No," he said. "They might search your baggage. Probably they would." "Baggage," said the Duchess. "As if I'd put them in me baggage. I'll put them next me skin. They won't search me in any case. They'll never find 'em. Not if I put them in me petticoats." There was a brutal realism about those words that staggered Hornblower a little, but which also brought him to admit to himself that there was something in what the Duchess was saying. "If they capture us," said the Duchess, "and I pray they won't, but if they do, they'll never keep me prisoner. You know that. They'll send me to Lisbon and put me aboard a king's ship as soon as they can. Then the despatches will be delivered eventually. Late, but better late than never." "That's so," mused Hornblower. "I'll guard them like my life," said the Duchess. "I swear I'll never part from them. I'll tell no one I have 'em, and not until I hand them to a king's officer." She met Hornblower's eyes with transparent honesty in her expression. "Fog's thinging, sir," said Wynyard. "Quick!" said the Duchess. There was no time for further debate. Hornblower slipped the envelopes from their binding of rope and handed them over to her, and replaced the belaying pin in the rail. "These damn French fashions," said the Duchess. "I was right when I said I'd put these letters up me petticoats. There's no room in me bosom." Certainly the upper part of her gown was not at all capacious. The waist hung down under the armpits, and the rest of the dress hung down from there quite straight in utter defiance of anatomy. "Give me a yard of that rope, quick," said the Duchess. Wynyard cut her a length of the line with his knife and handed it to her. Already she was hauling at her petticoats. The appalled Hornblower saw a gleam of white thigh above her stocking tops before he tore his glance away. The fog was certainly thinning. "You can look at me now," said the Duchess, but her petticoats only just fell in time as Hornblower looked round again. "They're inside my shift, next to my skin as I promised. With these directory fashions, no one wears stays any more, so I tied the rope round me waist outside me shift. One envelope is flat against me chest, and the other against me back. Would you suspect anything?" She turned round for Hornblower's inspection. "No, nothing shows," he said. "I must thank your Grace." "There is a certain thickening," said the Duchess, "but it does not matter what the Spaniards suspect as long as they do not suspect the truth." Momentary cessation of the need for action brought some embarrassment to Hornblower. To discuss with a woman her shift and stays, or the absence of them, was a strange thing to do. A watery sun, still nearly level, was breaking through the mist and shining in his eyes. The mainsail cast a watery shadow on the deck. With every second the sun was growing brighter. "Here it comes," said Hunter. The horizon ahead expanded rapidly, from a few yards to 100, from 100 yards to half a mile. The sea was covered with ships. No less than 6 were in plain sight, 4 ships of the line and 2 big frigates, with the red and gold of Spain at their mastheads and, what marked them even more obviously as Spaniards, huge wooden crosses hanging at their peaks. "Wear ship again, Mr. Hunter," said Hornblower. "Back into the fog." That was the one chance of safety. Those ships running down towards them were bound to ask questions, and they could not hope to avoid them all. The Rev spun round on her heel, but the fog bank from which she had emerged was already attenuated, sucked up by the thirsty sun. They could see a drifting stretch of it ahead, but it was lazily rolling away from them at the same time as it was dwindling. The heavy sound of a cannon shot reached their ears, and close on their starboard quarter, a ball threw up a fountain of water before plunging into the side of a wave just ahead. Hornblower looked round just in time to see the last of the puff of smoke from the bows of the frigate astern pursuing them. "Starboard 2 points," he said to the helmsman, trying to gauge at one and the same moment the frigate's course, the direction of the wind, the bearing of the other ships, and that of the thin nucleus of that wisp of fog. "Starboard 2 points," said the helmsman. "Fore and main sheets," said Hunter. Another shot, far astern this time, but laid true for line. Hornblower suddenly remembered the Duchess. "You must go below, your Grace." he said curtly. "Oh, no, no, no," burst out the Duchess with angry vehemence. "Please let me stay here. I can't go below to where that seasick maid of mine lies hoping to die. Not in that stinking box of a cabin." There would be no safety in that cabin, Hornblower reflected. Larev's scantlings were too fragile to keep out any shot at all. Down below the waterline in the hold the women might be safe, but they would have to lie flat on top of beef barrels. "Sail ahead!" screamed the lookout. The mist there was parting, and the outline of a ship of the line was emerging from it less than a mile away, and on almost the same course as Larev's. Thud, thud from the frigate astern. Those gunshots by now would have warned the whole Spanish fleet that something unusual was happening. The battleship ahead would know that the little sloop was being pursued. A ball tore through the air close by with its usual terrifying noise. The ship ahead was awaiting their coming. Hornblower saw her topsails slowly turning. "Hands to the sheets!" said Hornblower. "Mr. Hunter, jibe her over!" Larev came round again, heading for the lessening gap on the port side. The frigate astern turned to intercept. More jets of smoke from her bows. With an appalling noise, a shot passed within a few feet of Hornblower, so that the wind of it made him stagger. There was a hole in the mainsail. "Your Grace," said Hornblower, "those aren't warning shots." It was the ship of the line which fired them, having succeeded in clearing away and manning some of her upper-deck guns. It was as if the end of the world had come. One shot hit Larev's hull, and they felt the deck heave under their feet as a result, as if the little ship were disintegrating. But the mast was hit at the same moment, stays and shrouds parting, splinters raining all round. Mast, sails, boom, gaff and all went from above them over the side to windward. The wreckage dragged in the sea and turned the helpless wreck round with the last of her way. The little group aft stood momentarily dazed. "Anybody hurt?" asked Hornblower, recovering himself. "Only a scratch, sir," said one voice. It seemed a miracle that nobody was killed. "Carpenter's mate, sound the well," said Hornblower, and then, recollecting himself, "No, damn it, belay that order. If the Dons can save the ship, let 'em try." Already the ship of the line, whose salvo had done the damage, was filling her topsails again, and bearing away from them, whilst the frigate, which had pursued them, was running down on them fast. A wailing figure came scrambling out of the after hatchway. It was the Duchess's maid, so mad with terror that her seasickness was forgotten. The Duchess put a protective arm round her and tried to comfort her. "Your Grace had better look to your baggage," said Hornblower. "No doubt you'll be leaving us shortly for other quarters with the Dons. I hope you'll be more comfortable." He was trying desperately hard to speak in a matter-of-fact way, as if nothing out of the ordinary were happening, as if he were not soon to be a prisoner of the Spaniards. But the Duchess saw the working of the usually firm mouth, and marked how the hands were tight-clenched. "How can I tell you how sorry I am about this?" asked the Duchess, her voice soft with pity. "That makes it the harder for me to bear," said Hornblower, and he even forced a smile. The Spanish frigate was just rounding to, a cable's length to windward. "Please, sir," said Hunter. "Well?" "We can fight, sir. You give the word. Cold shot to drop in the boats when they try to board. We could beat 'em off once, perhaps." Hornblower's tortured misery nearly made him snap out, "Don't be a fool!" But he checked himself. He contented himself with pointing to the frigate. 20 guns were glaring at them at far less than point-blank range. The very boat the frigate was hoisting out would be manned by at least twice as many men as Larev carried. She was no bigger than many a pleasure yacht. It was not odds of 10 to 1 or 100 to 1, but odds of 10,000 to 1. "I understand, sir." Now the Spanish frigate's boat was in the water, about to shove off. "A private word with you, please, Mr. Hornblower," said the Duchess suddenly. Hunter and Wynyard heard what she said, and withdrew out of earshot. "Yes, your Grace," said Hornblower. The Duchess stood there, still with her arm round her weeping maid, looking straight at him. "I'm no more of a Duchess than you are," she said. "Good God!" said Hornblower. Who are you, then?" "Kitty Cobham." The name meant a little to Hornblower, but only a little. "You're too young for that name to have any memories for you, Mr. Hornblower, I see. It's 5 years since I last trod the boards." That was it. Kitty Cobham, the actress. I can't tell it all now, said the Duchess. The Spanish boat was dancing over the waves towards them. But when the French marched into Florence, that was only the last of my misfortunes. I was penniless when I escaped from them. Who would lift a finger for a one-time actress when I'd been betrayed and deserted? What was I to do? But a duchess. Well, that was another story. Old Dalrymple at Gibraltar could not do enough for the Duchess of Wharfdale. Why did you choose that title? Asked Hornblower, in spite of himself. I knew of her, said the Duchess, with a shrug of her shoulders. Well, I knew her to be what I played her as. That was why I chose her. I always played character parts better than straight comedy. They're not nearly so tedious in a long role. But my dispatches, said Hornblower, in a sudden panic of realization. Give them back, quick! If you wish me to, said the Duchess. But I can still be the Duchess when the Spaniards come. They'll still set me free as speedily as they can. I'll guard those dispatches better than my life. I swear it. I swear it. In less than a month I'll deliver them, if you trust me. Hornblower looked at the pleading eyes. She might be a spy, ingeniously trying to preserve the dispatches from being thrown overboard before the Spaniards took possession. But no spy could have hoped that Larev would run into the midst of the Spanish fleet. I made use of the bottle, I know, said the Duchess. I drank? Yes, I did. But I stayed sober in Gibraltar, didn't I? And I won't touch a drop, not a drop, until I'm in England. I'll swear that too. Please, sir, please. I'll beg of you. Let me do what I can for my country. It was a strange decision for a man of 19 to have to make. One who had never exchanged a word with an actress in his life before. A harsh voice overside told him that the Spanish boat was about to hook on. Keep them then, said Hornblower. Deliver them when you can. He had not taken his eyes from her face. He was looking for a gleam of triumph in her expression. Had he seen anything of the sort, he would have torn the dispatches from her body at that moment. But all he saw was the natural look of pleasure, and it was then that he made up his mind to trust her. Not before. Oh, thank you, sir, said the Duchess. The Spanish boat had hooked on now, and a Spanish lieutenant was awkwardly trying to climb aboard. He arrived on the deck on his hands and knees, and Hornblower stopped over to receive him as he got to his feet. Captor and captive exchanged bows. Hornblower could not understand what the Spaniard said, but obviously they were formal sentences that he was using. The Spaniard caught sight of the two women aft and halted in surprise. Hornblower hastily made the presentation in what he hoped was Spanish. Señor el Tente Español, he said. Señora la Duchessa de Wharfdale. The title clearly had its effect. The lieutenant bowed profoundly, and his bow was received with the most lofty aloofness by the Duchess. Hornblower could be sure the dispatches were safe. That was some alleviation of the misery of standing here on the deck of his waterlogged little ship, a prisoner of the Spaniards. As he waited, he heard from far to leeward roll upon roll of thunder coming up against the wind. No thunder could endure that long. What he could hear must be the broadsides of ships in action, of fleets in action. Somewhere over there by Cape St. Vincent, the British fleet must have caught the Spaniards at last. Fiercer and fiercer sounded the roll of artillery. There was excitement among the Spaniards, who had scrambled onto the deck of the Rev, while Hornblower stood bareheaded, waiting to be taken into captivity. Captivity was a dreadful thing. Once the numbness had worn off, Hornblower came to realize what a dreadful thing it was. Not even the news of the dreadful battering which the Spanish Navy had received at St. Vincent could relieve the misery and despair of being a prisoner. It was not the physical conditions. 10 square feet of floor space per man in an empty sail loft at Ferrol, along with other captive warrant officers, for they were no worse than what a junior officer often had to put up with at sea. It was the loss of freedom, the fact of being a captive, that was so dreadful. There were 4 months of it before the first letter came through to Hornblower. The Spanish government, inefficient in all ways, had the worst postal system in Europe. But here was the letter, addressed and readdressed, now safely in his hands after he had practically snatched it from a stupid Spanish non-commissioned officer who had been puzzling over the strange name. Hornblower did not know the handwriting, and when he broke the seal and opened the letter, the salutation made him think for a moment that he had opened someone else's letter. "Darling boy," it began. Now who on earth would call him that? He read on in a dream. "Darling boy, I hope it will give you happiness to hear that what you gave me has reached its destination. They told me, when I delivered it, that you were a prisoner, and my heart bleeds for you. And they told me, too, that they were pleased with you for what you had done. And one of those admirals is a shareholder in Drury Lane. Whoever would have thought of such a thing? But he smiled at me, and I smiled at him. I did not know he was a shareholder then, and I only smiled out of the kindness of my heart. And all that I told him about my dangers and perils with my precious burden were only histrionic exercises, I am afraid. Yet he believed me, and so struck was he by my smile and my adventures that he demanded a part for me from Sherry. And behold, now I am playing second lead, usually a tragic mother, and receiving the acclaim of the groundlings. There are compensations in growing old, which I am discovering too. And I have not tasted wine since I saw you last, nor shall I ever again. As one more reward, my admiral promised me that he would forward this letter to you in the next cartel, an expression which no doubt means more to you than to me. I can only hope that it reaches you in good time and brings you comfort in your affliction. I pray nightly for you. Ever your devoted friend, Catherine Cobham. Comfort in his affliction? A little, perhaps. There was some comfort in knowing that the dispatches had been delivered. There was some comfort in a second-hand report that their lordships were pleased with him. There was comfort even in knowing that the Duchess was re-established on the stage. But the sum total was nothing compared with his misery. Here was a guard come to bring him to the commandant, and beside the commandant was the Irish renegade who served as interpreter. There were further papers on the commandant's desk. It looked as if the same cartel which had brought in Kitty Cobham's note had brought in letters for the commandant. "Good afternoon, sir," said the commandant, always polite, offering a chair. "Good afternoon, sir, and many thanks," said Hornblower. He was learning Spanish slowly and painfully. "You have been promoted," said the Irishman in English. "What?" said Hornblower. "Promoted," said the Irishman. "Here's the letter. The Spanish authorities are informed that on account of his meritorious service, the acting commission of Mr. Hornblower, Midshipman and Acting Lieutenant, has been confirmed. Their Lordships of the Admiralty express their confidence that Mr. Horatio Hornblower will be admitted immediately to the privileges of commissioned rank. There you are, young man." "My felicitations, sir," said the Commandant. "Many thanks, sir." The Commandant was a kindly old gentleman, with a pleasant smile for the awkward young man. He went on to say more, but Hornblower's Spanish was not equal to the technicalities he used, and Hornblower, in despair, looked at the interpreter. "Now that you're a commissioned officer," said the latter, "you'll be transferred to the quarters for captured officers." "Thank you," said Hornblower. "And you will receive the half pay of your rank." "Thank you." "And your parole will be accepted. You'll be at liberty to visit the town and the neighbourhood for 2 hours each day, given your parole." "Thank you," said Mr. Hornblower. Perhaps, during the long months which followed, it was some mitigation of his unhappiness that for 2 hours each day his parole gave him freedom to wander in the streets of the little town, to have a cup of chocolate or a glass of wine, providing he had any money, making polite and laborious conversation with Spanish soldiers or sailors or civilians. But it was better to spend his 2 hours wandering over the goat paths of the headland in the wind and the sun, in the companionship of the sea, which might alleviate the sick misery of captivity. There was slightly better food, slightly better quarters, and there was the knowledge that now he was a lieutenant, that he held the King's commission, that if ever, the war should end and he should be set free, he could starve on half pay, for with the end of the war there would be no employment for junior lieutenants. But he had earned his promotion. He had gained the approval of authority, and that was something to think about on his solitary walks. There came a day of southwesterly gales, with the wind shrieking in from across the Atlantic. Across 3,000 miles of water it came, building up its strength unimpeded on its way, and heaping up the sea into racing mountain ridges, which came crashing in upon the Spanish coast in thunder and spray. Hornblower stood on the headland above Ferrol harbour, holding his worn greatcoat about him as he leaned forward into the wind to keep his footing. So powerful was the wind that it was difficult to breathe while facing it. If he turned his back, he could breathe more easily, but then the wind blew his wild hair forward over his eyes, almost inverted his greatcoat over his head, and furthermore forced him into little tottering steps down the slope towards Ferrol, whither he had no wish to return at present. For 2 hours he was alone and free, and those 2 hours were precious. He could breathe the Atlantic air. He could walk. He could do as he liked during that time. He could stare out to sea. It was not unusual to catch sight from the headland of some British ship of war which might be working slowly along the coast, in the hope of snapping up a coasting vessel while keeping a watchful eye upon the Spanish naval activity. When such a ship went by during Hornblower's 2 hours of freedom, he would stand and gaze upon it, as a man dying of thirst might gaze at a bucket of water held beyond his reach. He would note all the little details, the cut of her topsails and the style of the paint, while misery wrung his bowels. For this was the end of his 2nd year as a prisoner of war. For 22 months, for 22 hours every day, he had been under lock and key, herded with 5 other junior lieutenants in a single room in the fortress of Ferrol. And today the wind roared by him, shouting in its outrageous freedom. He was facing into the wind. Before him lay Corona, its white houses resembling pieces of sugar scattered over the slopes. Between him and Corona was all the open space of Corona Bay, flogged white by the wind, and on his left hand was the narrow entrance to Ferrol Bay. On his right was the open Atlantic. From the foot of the low cliffs there, the long wicked reef of the Diente del Diablo, the Devil's Teeth, ran out to the northward, square across the path of the racing rollers driven by the wind. At half-minute intervals, the rollers would crash against the reef with an impact that shook even the solid headland on which Hornblower stood, and each roller dissolved into spray which was instantly whirled by the wind to reveal again the long black tusks of the rocks. Hornblower was not alone on the headland. A few yards away from him, a Spanish militia artilleryman on lookout duty gazed with watery eyes through a telescope with which he continually swept the seaward horizon. When at war with England, it was necessary to be vigilant. A fleet might suddenly appear over the horizon, to land a little army to capture Ferrol and burn the dockyard installation and the ships. No hope of that today, thought Hornblower. There could be no landing of troops on that raging lee shore. But all the same, the sentry was undoubtedly staring very fixedly through his telescope right to windward. The sentry wiped his streaming eyes with his coat sleeve and stared again. Hornblower peered in the same direction, unable to see what it was that had attracted the sentry's attention. The sentry muttered something to himself, and then turned and ran clumsily down to the little stone guardhouse, where sheltered the rest of the militia detachment, stationed there to man the guns of the battery on the headland. He returned with the sergeant of the guard, who took the telescope and peered out to windward in the direction pointed out by the sentry. The two of them jabbered in their barbarous Gallego dialect. In 2 years of steady application, Hornblower had mastered Galician as well as Castilian, but in that howling gale he could not intercept a word. Then, finally, just as the sergeant nodded in agreement, Hornblower finally saw with his naked eye what they were discussing. A pale grey square on the horizon, above the grey sea. A ship's topsail. She must be running before the gale, making for the shelter of Corona or Ferrol. It was a rash thing for a ship to do, because it would be no easy matter for her to round to into Corona Bay and anchor, and it would be even harder for her to hit off the narrow entrance to the Ferrol Inlet. A cautious captain would claw out to sea, and heave to with a generous amount of sea room, until the wind moderated. These Spanish captains, said Hornblower to himself with a shrug of his shoulders, but naturally they would always wish to make harbour as quickly as possible when the Royal Navy was sweeping the seas. But the sergeant and the sentries were more excited than the appearance of a single ship would seem to justify. Hornblower could contain himself no longer, and edged up to the chattering pair, mentally framing his sentences in the unfamiliar tongue. "Please, gentlemen," he said. and then started again, shouting against the wind. "Please, gentlemen, what is it that you see?" The sergeant gave him a glance, and then, reaching some undiscoverable decision, handed over the telescope. Hornblower could hardly restrain himself from snatching it from his hands. With the telescope to his eye, he could see far better. He could see a ship-rigged vessel, under close-reefed topsails, and that was much more sail than it was wise to carry, hurtling wildly towards them. And then a moment later, he saw the other square of grey, another topsail, another ship. The foretopmast was noticeably shorter than the main topmast, and not only that, but the whole effect was familiar. She was a British ship of war, a British frigate, plunging along in hot pursuit of the other, which seemed most likely to be a Spanish privateer. It was a close chase. It would be a very near thing, whether the Spaniard would reach the protection of the shore batteries before the frigate overhauled her. He lowered the telescope to rest his eye, and instantly the sergeant snatched it from him. He had been watching the Englishman's face, and Hornblower's expression had told him what he wanted to know. Those two ships out there were behaving in such a way as to justify his rousing his officer and giving the alarm. Sergeant and sentry went running back to the guardhouse, and in a few moments the artillerymen were pouring out to man the batteries on the verge of the cliff. Soon enough came a mounted officer, urging his horse up the path. A single glance through the telescope sufficed for him. He went clattering down to the battery, and the next moment the boom of a gun from there alerted the rest of the defences. The flag of Spain rose up on the flagstaff beside the battery, and Hornblower saw an answering flag rise up the flagstaff on San Anton, where another battery guarded Corona Bay. All the guns of the harbour defences were now manned, and there could be no mercy shown to any English ship that came in range. Pursuer and pursued had covered quite half of the distance already towards Corona. They were hull up over the horizon now to Hornblower on the headland, who could see them plunging madly over the grey sea. Hornblower momentarily expected to see them carry away their topmasts or their sails blow from the bolt ropes. The frigate was half a mile astern still, and she would have to be much closer than that to have any hope of hitting with her guns in that sea. Here came the commandant and his staff, clattering on horseback, up the path to see the climax of the drama. The commandant caught sight of Hornblower and doffed his hat with Spanish courtesy, while Hornblower, hatless, tried to bow with equal courtesy. Hornblower walked over to him with an urgent request. He had to lay his hand on the Spaniard's saddle-brow and shout up into his face to be understood. "My parole expires in 10 minutes, sir," he yelled. "May I please extend it? May I please stay?" "Yes, stay, senor," said the commandant generously. Hornblower watched the chase, and at the same time observed closely the preparations for defence. He had given his parole, but no part of the gentlemanly code prevented him from taking note all he could see. One day he might be free, and one day it might be useful to know all about the defences of Ferrol. Everyone else of the large group on the headland was watching the chase, and excitement rose higher as the ships came racing nearer. The English captain was keeping 100 yards or more to seaward of the Spaniard, but he was quite unable to overhaul her. In fact, it seemed to Hornblower as if the Spaniard was actually increasing his lead. But the English frigate being to seaward meant that escape in that direction was cut off. Any turn away from the land would reduce the Spaniard's lead to a negligible distance. If he did not get into Corona Bay or Ferrol Inlet, he was doomed. Now he was level with the Corona headland, and it was time to put his helm hard over and turn into the bay and hope that his anchors would hold in the lee of the headland. But with a wind of that violence hurtling against cliffs and headlands, strange things can happen. A flaw of wind coming out of the bay must have caught her aback as she tried to round to. Hornblower saw her stagger, saw her heel as the backlash died away, and the gale caught her again. She was laid over almost on her beam ends, and as she righted herself, Hornblower saw a momentary gap open up in her main topsail. It was momentary, because from the time the gap appeared, the life of the topsail was momentary. The gap appeared, and at once the sail vanished, blown into ribbons as soon as its continuity was impaired. With the loss of its balancing pressure, the ship became unmanageable. The gale pressing against the foretopsail swung her round again before the wind like a weather vane. If there had been time to spare to set a fragment of sail farther aft, she would have been saved, but in those enclosed waters there was no time to spare. At one moment, she was about to round the Corona headland. At the next, she had lost the opportunity forever. There was still the chance that she might fetch the opening into the Ferrol inlet. The wind was nearly fair for her to do that. Nearly. Hornblower on the Ferrol headland was thinking along with the Spanish captain down there on the heaving deck. He saw him try to steady the ship so as to head for the narrow entrance, notorious among seamen for its difficulty. He saw him get her on course, and for a few seconds as she flew across the mouth of the bay, it seemed as if the Spaniard would succeed, against all probability, in exactly hitting off the entrance to the inlet. Then the backlash hit her again. Had she been quick on the helm, she might still have been safe, but with her sail pressure so outbalanced, she was bound to be slow in response to her rudder. The shrieking wind blew her bows round, and it was instantly obvious, too, that she was doomed. But the Spanish captain played the game out to the last. He would not pile his ship up against the foot of the low cliffs. He put his helm hard over. With the aid of the wind rebounding from the cliffs, he made a gallant attempt to clear the Ferrol headland altogether and give himself a chance to claw out to sea. A gallant attempt, but doomed to failure as soon as begun. He actually cleared the headland, but the wind blew his bows round again, and, bows first, the ship plunged right at the long, jagged line of the Devil's Teeth. Hornblower, the commandant, and everyone hurried across the headland to look down at the final act of the tragedy. With tremendous speed, driving straight before the wind, she raced at the reef. A roller picked her up, and as she neared it and seemed to increase her speed, then she struck and vanished from sight for a second as the roller burst into spray all about her. When the spray cleared, she lay there transformed. Her three masts were all gone with the shock, and it was only a black hull which emerged from the white foam. Her speed and the roller behind her had carried her almost over the reef, doubtless tearing her bottom out, and she hung by her stern, which stood out clear of the water, while her bows were just submerged in the comparatively still water in the lee of the reef. There were still men alive on her. Hornblower could see them crouching for shelter under the break of her poop. Another Atlantic roller came surging up and exploded on the Devil's Teeth, wrapping the wreck round with spray. But yet she emerged again, black against the creaming foam. She had cleared the reef sufficiently far to find shelter for most of her length in the lee of that thing that had destroyed her. Hornblower could see those living creatures crouching on her deck. They had a little longer to live. They might live 5 minutes, perhaps, if they were lucky. 5 hours if they were not. All round him the Spaniards were shouting maledictions. Women were weeping. Some of the men were shaking their fists with rage at the British frigate which, well satisfied with the destruction of her victim, had rounded to in time and was now clawing out to sea again on the storm canvas. It was horrible to see those poor devils down there die. If some larger wave than usual, bursting on the reef, did not lift the stern of the wreck clear so that she sank, she would still break up, for the survivors to be whirled away with the fragments. And, if it took a long time for her to break up, the wretched men sheltering there would not be able to endure the constant beating of the cold spray upon them. Something should be done to save them, but no boat could round the headland and weather the Devil's Teeth to reach the wreck. That was so obvious as not to call for a second thought. But Hornblower's thoughts began to race as he started to work on the alternatives. The commandant on his horse was speaking vehemently to a Spanish naval officer, clearly on the same subject, and the naval officer was spreading his hands and saying that for any attempt would be hopeless. And yet, for 2 years Hornblower had been a prisoner. All his pent-up restlessness was seeking an outlet, and after 2 years of the misery of confinement, he did not care whether he lived or whether he died. He went up to the commandant and broke into the argument. "Sir," he said, "let me try to save them. Perhaps from the little bay there, perhaps some of the fishermen would come with me." The commandant looked at the officer, and the officer shrugged his shoulders. "What do you suggest, sir?" asked the commandant of Hornblower. "We might carry a boat across the headland from the dockyard," said Hornblower, struggling to word his ideas in Spanish. "But we must be quick. Quick!" He pointed to the wreck, and force were added to his words by the sight of a roller bursting over the Devil's Teeth. "How would you carry a boat?" asked the commandant. To shout his plan in English against that wind would have been a strain. To do it in Spanish was beyond him. "I can show you to the dockyard, sir," he yelled. "I cannot explain, but we must hurry." "You want to go to the dockyard, then?" "Yes. Oh, yes!" "Mount behind me, sir," said the commandant. Awkwardly, Hornblower scrambled up to a seat astride the horse's haunches and clutched at the commandant's belt. He bumped frightfully as the animal wheeled round and trotted down the slope. All the idlers of the town and the garrison ran beside them. The dockyard at Ferrol was almost a phantom organisation, withered away like a tree deprived of its roots thanks to the British blockade. Situated as it was, in the most distant corner of Spain, connected with the interior by only the roughest of roads, it relied on receiving its supplies by sea, and any such reliance was likely, with British cruisers off the coast, to be disappointed. The last visit of Spanish ships of war had stripped the place of almost all of its stores, and many of the dockyard hands had been pressed as seamen at the same time. But all that Hornblower needed was there, as he knew, thanks to his careful observations. He slid off the horse's hindquarters, miraculously avoiding an instinctive kick from the irritated animal, and collected his thoughts. He pointed to a low dray, a mere platform on wheels, which was used for carrying beef barrels and brandy kegs to the pier. "Horses," he said, and a dozen willing hands set to work harnessing a team. Beside the jetty floated half a dozen boats. There was tackle and shears, all the apparatus necessary for swinging heavy weights about. To put slings under a boat and swing her up was the work of only a minute or two. These Spaniards might be dilatory and lazy as a rule, but inspire them with the need for instant action, catch their enthusiasm, present them with a novel plan, and they would work like madmen. And some of them were skilled workmen too. Oars, mast and sail, not that they would need the sail, rudder, tiller and bailers were all present. A group came running from a store shed with chocks for the boat, and the moment these were set up on the dray was backed under the tackle and the boat lowered onto them. "Empty barrels," said Hornblower. "Little ones." A swarthy Galician fisherman grasped his intention at once, and amplified Hornblower's halting sentences with voluble explanation. A dozen empty water breakers, with their bungs driven well home, were brought, and the swarthy fisherman climbed on the dray and began to lash them under the thwarts. Properly secured, they would keep the boat afloat, even when she was filled to the gunwale with water. "I want 6 men," shouted Hornblower, standing on the dray and looking round at the crowd. 6 fishermen who know little boats." The swarthy fisherman lashing the breakers in the boat looked up from his task. "I know whom we need, sir," he said. He shouted a string of names, and half a dozen men came forward. Burly, weather-beaten fellows, with a self-reliant look in their faces of men used to meeting difficulties. It was apparent that the swarthy Galician was their captain. "Let us go, then," said Hornblower, but the Galician checked him. Hornblower did not need to hear what he said, but some of the crowd nodded, turned away, and came hastening back, staggering under a breaker of fresh water and a box that must contain biscuit. Hornblower was cross with himself, forgetting the possibility of their being blown out to sea, and the commandant, still sitting his horse and watching these preparations with a keen eye, took note of these stores too. "Remember, sir, that I have your parole," he said. "You have my parole, sir," said Hornblower. For a few blessed moments he had actually forgotten that he was a prisoner. The stores were safely put away into the stern sheets, and the fishing boat's captain caught Hornblower's eye and got a nod from him. "Let us go," he roared to the crowd. The iron-shod hooves clashed on the cobbles, and the dray lurched forward, with men leading the horses, men swarming alongside, and Hornblower and the captain riding on the dray like triumphing generals in a procession. They went through the dockyard gate, along the level main street of the little town, and turned up a steep lane which climbed the ridge constituting the backbone of the headland. The enthusiasm of the crowd was still lively. When the horses slowed as they breasted the slope, 100 men pushed at the back, strained at the side, tugged at the traces to run the dray up the hillside. At the crest, the lane became a track, but the dray still lurched and rumbled along. From the track diverged an even worse track, winding its way sideways down the slope through arbutus and myrtle towards the sandy cove which Hornblower first had in mind. On fine days, He had seen fishermen working a seine net on that beach, and he himself had taken note of it as a suitable place for a landing party, should the Royal Navy ever plan a descent against Ferrol. The wind was blowing wildly as ever. It shrieked round Hornblower's ears. The sea, as it came in view, was chaotic with wave crests, and then as they turned a shoulder of the slope, they could see the line of the Devil's Teeth, running out from the shore up there to windward, and still hanging precariously from their jagged fangs was the wreck, black against the seething foam. Somebody raised a shout at the sight. Everybody heaved at the dray, so that the horses actually broke into a trot, and the dray leaped and bounced over the obstructions in its way. "Slowly!" roared Hornblower. "Slowly!" If they were to break an axle or smash a wheel at this moment, the attempt would end in ludicrous failure. The commandant on his horse enforced Hornblower's cries with loud orders of his own, and restrained the reckless enthusiasm of his people. More sedately, the dray went down on the trail to the edge of the sandy beach. The wind picked up even the damp sand and flung it stinging into their faces. But only small waves broke here, for the beach was in a recess in the shoreline. The southwesterly wind was blowing a trifle offshore here, and up to windward the Devil's Teeth broke the force of the rollers as they raced along in a direction nearly parallel to the shoreline. The wheels plunged into the sand, and the horses stopped at the water's edge. A score of willing hands unharnessed them, and 100 willing arms thrust the dray out into the water. All of these things were easy with such vast manpower available. As the first wave broke over the floor of the dray, the crew scrambled up and stood ready. There were rocks here, but mighty heaves by the militiamen and the dockyard workers, waist deep in water, forced the dray over them. The boat almost floated off its chocks, and the crew forced it clear and scrambled aboard, the wind beginning to swing her immediately. They grabbed for their oars and put their backs into half a dozen fierce strokes, which brought her under command. The Galician captain had already laid a steering oar in the notch in the stern, with no attempt at shipping rudder and tiller. As he braced himself to steer, he glanced at Hornblower, who tacitly left the job to him. Hornblower, bent against the wind, was standing in the stern sheets, planning a route through the rocks which would lead them to the wreck. The shore and the friendly beach were gone now, incredibly far away, and the boat was struggling out through a welter of water with the wind howling round her. In those jumbled waves, her motion was senseless, and she lurched in every direction successively. It was well that the boatmen were used to rowing in broken water, so that their oars kept the boat under way, giving the captain the means by which, tugging fiercely at the steering oar, he could guide her through that maniacal confusion. Hornblower, planning his course, was able to guide the captain by his gestures, so that the captain could devote all the necessary attention to keeping the boat from being suddenly capsized by an unexpected wave. The wind howled, and the boat heaved and pitched as she met each lumpy wave, but yard by yard they were struggling up to the wreck. If there was any order in the waves at all, they were swinging round the outer end of the Devil's Teeth, so that the boat had to be carefully steered, turning to meet the waves with her bows, and then turning back to gain precarious yards against the wind. Hornblower spared a glance for the men at the oars. At every second they were exerting their utmost strength. There could never be a moment's respite. Tug and strain, until Hornblower wondered how human hearts and sinews could endure it. But they were edging up towards the wreck. Hornblower, when the wind and spray allowed, could see the whole extent of her canted deck now. He could see human figures cowering under the break of the poop. He saw somebody there wave an arm to him. Next moment, his attention was called away when a jagged monster suddenly leaped out of the sea 20 yards ahead. For a second, he could not imagine what it was, and then it leaped clear again, and he recognized it, the butt end of a broken mast. The mast was still anchored to the ship by a single surviving shroud attached to the upper end of the mast and to the ship, and the mast, drifting down to leeward, was jerking and leaping on the waves as though some sea god below the surface was threatening them with his wrath. Hornblower called the steersman's attention to the menace, and received a nod in return. The steersman shouted, "Nombre de Dios!" was whirled away in the wind. They kept clear of the mast. As they pulled up along it, Hornblower could form a clearer notion of the speed of their progress now that he had a stationary object to help his judgment. He could see the painful inches gained at each frantic tug on the oars, and could see how the boat stopped dead, or even went astern when the wilder gusts hit her, the oar blades pulling ineffectively through the water. Every inch of gain was only won at the cost of an infinity of labour. Now they were past the mast, close to the submerged bows of the ship, and close enough to the Devil's Teeth to be deluged with spray as each wave burst on the farther side of the reef. There were inches of water washing back and forth in the bottom of the boat, but there was neither time nor opportunity to bail it out. This was the trickiest part of the whole effort, to get close enough alongside the wreck to be able to take off the survivors without stoving in the boat. There were wicked fangs of rock all about the after end of the wreck, while forward, although the forecastle was above the surface at times, the forward part of the waist was submerged. But the ship was canted a little over to port towards them, which made the approach easier. When the water was at its lowest level, immediately before the next roller broke on the reef, Hornblower, standing up and craning his neck, could see no rocks beside the wreck in the middle part of the waist, where the deck came down to water level. It was easy to direct the steersman towards that particular point, and then, as the boat moved in, to wave his arms and demand the attention of the little group under the break of the poop, and to point to the spot which they were approaching. A wave burst upon the reef, broken over the stern of the wreck, and filled the boat almost full. She swung back and forth in the eddies, but the kegs kept her afloat, and quick handling of the steering oar and lusty rowing kept her from being dashed against either the wreck or the rocks. "Now!" shouted Hornblower. It did not matter that he spoke English at this decisive moment. The boat surged forward, while the survivors, releasing themselves from the lashings which had held them in their shelter, came slithering down the deck towards them. It was a little of a shock to see there were but 4 of them. 20 or 30 men must have been swept overboard when the ship hit the reef. The bows of the boat moved toward the wreck. At a shouted order from the steersman, the oars fell still. One survivor braced himself and flung himself into the bows. A stroke of the oars, a tug at the steering oar, and the boat nosed forward again, and another survivor plunged into the boat. Then Hornblower, who had been watching the sea, saw the next breaker rear up over the reef. At his warning shout, the boat backed away to safety, comparative safety, while the remaining survivors went scrambling back up the deck to the shelter of the poop. The wave burst and roared, the foam hissed and the spray rattled, and then they crept up to the wreck again. The third survivor poised himself for his leap, mistimed it and fell into the sea, and no one ever saw him again. He was gone, sunk like a stone, crippled as he was with cold and exhaustion, but there was no time to spare for lamentation. The 4th survivor was waiting his chance, and jumped at once, landing safely in the bows. "Any more?" shouted Hornblower, and receiving a shake of the head in reply. They had saved 3 lives at the risk of 8. "Let us go," said Hornblower, but the steersman needed no telling. Already he had allowed the wind to drift the boat away from the wreck, away from the rocks, away from the shore. An occasional strong pull at the oars sufficed to keep her bows to wind and wave. Hornblower looked down at the fainting survivors lying in the bottom of the boat, with the water washing over them. He bent down and shook them into consciousness. He picked up the bailers and forced them into their numb hands. They must keep active or die. It was astounding to find darkness closing about them, and it was urgent that they should decide on their next move immediately. The men at the oars were in no shape for any further prolonged rowing. If they tried to return to the sandy cove whence they had started, they might be overtaken both by night and by exhaustion, while still among the treacherous rocks off the shore there. Hornblower sat down beside the Galatian captain, who laconically gave his views, while vigilantly observing the waves racing down upon them. "It's growing dark," said the captain, glancing round the sky. "Rocks. The men are tired." "We had better not go back," said Hornblower. "No." "Then we must get out to sea." Years of duty on blockade, of beating about off a lee shore, had ingrained into Hornblower the necessity for seeking sea room. "Yes," said the captain, and he added something which Hornblower, thanks to the wind and his unfamiliarity with the language, was unable to catch. The captain roared the expression again, and accompanied his words with a vivid bit of pantomime with the one hand he could spare from the steering oar. "A sea anchor," decided Hornblower to himself. "Quite right." He looked back at the vanishing shore and gauged the direction of the wind. It seemed to be backing a little southerly. The coast here trended away from them. They could ride to a sea anchor through the hours of darkness and run no risk of being cast ashore as long as these conditions persisted. "Good," said Hornblower aloud. He imitated the other's bit of pantomime, and the captain gave him a glance of approval. At a bellow from him, the two men forward took in their oars and set to work constructing a sea anchor, merely a pair of oars attached to a long painter paid out over the bows. With this gale blowing, the pressure of the wind on the boat set up enough drag on the float to keep their bows to the sea. Hornblower watched as the sea anchor began to take hold of the water. "Good," he said again. "Good," said the captain, taking in his steering oar. Hornblower realized only now that he had been long exposed to a winter gale while wet to the skin. He was numb with the cold, and he was shivering uncontrollably. At his feet, one of the three survivors of the wreck was lying helplessly. The other two had succeeded in bailing out most of the water, and as a result of their exertions, were conscious and alert. The men who had been rowing sat drooping with weariness on their thwarts. The Galatian captain was already down in the bottom of the boat, lifting the helpless man into his arms. It was a common impulse of them all to huddle down into the bottom of the boat beneath the thwarts, away from the shrieking wind. So night came down on them. Hornblower found himself welcoming the contact of other human bodies. He felt an arm round him, and he put his arm round someone else. Around them, a little water still surged about on the floorboards. Above them, the wind still shrieked and howled. The boat stood first on her head, and then on her tail, as the waves passed under them, and at the moment of climbing, each crest she gave a shuddering jerk as she snubbed herself to the sea anchor. Every few seconds, a new spat of spray whirled into the boat, upon their shrinking bodies. It did not seem long before the accumulation of spray in the bottom of the boat made it necessary for them to disentangle themselves, and set about, groping in the darkness, the task of bailing the water out again. Then they could huddle down again under the thwarts. It was when they pulled themselves together for the third bailing that in the middle of his nightmare of cold and exhaustion, Hornblower was conscious that the body across which his arm lay was unnaturally stiff. The man the captain had been trying to revive had died as he lay there between the captain and Hornblower. The captain dragged the body away into the stern sheets in the darkness, and the night went on. Cold wind and cold spray, jerk, pitch and roll, sit up and bail, and cower down and shudder. It was hideous torment. Hornblower could not trust himself to believe his eyes when he saw the first signs that the darkness was lessening. And then the grey dawn came gradually over the grey sea, and they were free to wonder at what to do next. But as the light increased, the problem was solved for them, for one of the fishermen, raising himself up in the boat, gave a hoarse cry and pointed to the northern horizon, and there, almost hull up, was a ship, hove to on a storm canvas. The captain took one glance at her. His eyesight must have been marvellous, and identified her. "The English frigate," he said. She must have made nearly the same amount of leeway hove to as the boat did riding to her sea anchor. "Signal to her," said Hornblower, and no one raised any objections. The only white object available was Hornblower's shirt, and he took it off, shuddering in the cold, and they tied it to an oar and raised the oar in the mast-step. The captain saw Hornblower putting on his dripping coat over his bare ribs, and in a single movement peeled off his thick blue jersey and offered it to him. "Thank you, no," but the captain insisted. With a wide grin, he pointed to the stiffened corpse lying in the stern sheet, and announced that he would replace the jersey with the dead man's clothing. The argument was interrupted by a further cry from one of the fishermen. The frigate was coming to wind. With treble-reefed fore and main topsails, she was heading straight for them under the impulse of the lessening gale. Hornblower saw her running down on them, and a glance in the other direction showed him the Galician mountains, faint on the southern horizon. Warmth, freedom and friendship on the one hand, solitude and captivity on the other. Under the lee of the frigate, the boat bobbed and heaved fantastically. Many inquisitive faces looked down on them. They were cold and cramped. The frigate dropped a boat and a couple of nimble seamen scrambled aboard. A line was flung from the frigate. A whip lowered a breeches ring into the boat, and the English seamen helped the Spaniards one by one into the breeches and held them steady as they were swung up onto the frigate's deck. "I go last," said Hornblower, when he turned to them. "I am a king's officer." "Good lorlum," said the seaman. "Send the body up too," said Hornblower. "It can be given a decent burial." The stiff corpse was grotesque as it swayed through the air. The Galician captain tried to dispute with Hornblower the honour of going last, but Hornblower could not be argued with. Then, finally, the seaman helped him put his legs into the breeches and secured him with a line round his waist. Up he soared, swaying dizzily with the roll of the ship. Then they drew him into the deck, lowering and shortening, until half a dozen strong arms took his weight and laid him gently on the deck. "There you are, me hearty, safe and sound," said a bearded seaman. "I am a king's officer," said Hornblower. "Where's the officer of the watch?" Wearing marvellously dry clothing, Hornblower soon found himself drinking hot rum and water in the cabin of Captain George Crome of His Majesty's frigate Syrtis. Crome was a thin, pale man with a depressed expression, but Hornblower knew of him as a first-rate officer. "These Galicians make good seamen," said Crome. "I can't press them. Perhaps a few will volunteer sooner than go to a prison hulk." "Sir," said Hornblower, and hesitated. It was ill for a junior lieutenant to argue with a post-captain. "Well?" "Those men came to sea to save life. They are not liable to capture." Crome's cold grey eyes became actively frosty. Hornblower was right about it being ill for a junior lieutenant to argue with a post-captain. "Are you telling me my duty, sir?" he asked. "Good heavens, no, sir," said Hornblower hastily. "It's a long time since I read the Admiralty's instructions, and I expect my memory's at fault." "Admiralty instructions, eh?" said Crome, in a slightly different tone of voice. "I expect I'm wrong, sir," said Hornblower, "but I seem to remember the same instruction applied to the other two, the survivors." Even a post-captain could only contravene Admiralty instructions at his peril. "I'll consider it," said Crome. "I had the dead man sent on board, sir," went on Hornblower, "in the hopes that perhaps you might give him a proper burial. Those Galicians risked their lives to save him, sir, and I expect they'd be gratified." "A popish burial? I'll give orders to give him a free hand." "Thank you, sir," said Hornblower. "And now, as regards yourself, you say you hold a commission as lieutenant. You can do duty in the ship until we meet the Admiral again. Then he can decide. I haven't heard of the Indefatigable paying off, and legally you still may be born on her books." And that was when the devil came to tempt Hornblower, as he took another sip of hot rum and water. The joy of being in the king's ship again was so keen as to be almost painful. To taste salt beef and biscuit again, and never again to taste beans and garbanzos. To have a ship's deck under his feet. To talk English. To be free. To be free! There was precious little chance of ever falling into Spanish hands again. Hornblower remembered with agonizing clarity the flat depression of captivity. All he had to do was not to say a word. He had only to keep silence for a day or two. But the devil did not tempt him long. Only until he had taken his next sip of rum and water. Then he thrust the devil behind him, and he met Crome's eyes again. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "What for?" "I am here on parole. I gave my word before I left the beach." "You did? Well, that alters the case. You're within your rights, of course." The giving of parole by captive British officers was so usual as to excite no comment. "It was in the usual form, I suppose," went on Crome, "that you would make no attempt to escape?" "Yes, sir." "Then what do you decide as a result?" Of course Crome could not attempt to influence a gentleman's decision on a matter as personal as parole. "I must go back, sir," said Hornblower, "at the first opportunity." He felt the sway of the ship. He looked round the homely cabin, and his heart was breaking. "Well, you can at least dine and sleep on board tonight," said Crome. "I'll not venture inshore again until the wind moderates. I'll send you to Corona under a flag of truce when I can, and I'll see what the instructions say about those prisoners." It was a sunny morning when the sentry at Fort San Anton, in the harbour of Corona, called his officer's attention to the fact that the British cruiser off the headland had hove to out of gunshot and was lowering a boat. The sentry's responsibility ended there, and he could watch idly as his officer observed that the cutter, running smartly in under sail, was flying a white flag. She hove to within musket shot, and it was a mild surprise to the sentry when, in reply to the officer's hail, someone rose up in the boat and replied in unmistakable Gallego dialect. Summoned alongside the landing slip, the cutter put ashore 10 men, and then headed out again to the frigate. 9 men were laughing and shouting. The 10th, the youngest, walked with a fixed expression on his face, with never a sign of emotion. His expression did not change, even when the others, with obvious affection, put their arms round his shoulders. No one ever troubled to explain to the sentry who the imperturbable young man was, and he was not very interested. After he had seen the group shipped off across Corona Bay towards Ferrol, he quite forgot about the incident. It was almost spring when a Spanish militia officer came into the barracks which served as a prison for officers in Ferrol. "Senor Hornblower?" he asked. At least, Hornblower in the corner knew that's what he was trying to say. He was used to the way Spaniards mutilated his name. "Yes," he said, rising. Would you please come with me? The Commandant has sent me for you." The Commandant was all smiles. He held a dispatch in his hands. "This, sir," he said, waving it at Hornblower, "is a personal order. It is countersigned by the Duke of Fontesacco, Minister for Marine, but it is signed by the First Minister, Prince of the Peace, and Duke of Alcudia." "Yes, sir." He should have begun to hope at that moment, but there comes a time in a prisoner's life when he ceases to hope. He was more interested, even, in that strange title of Prince of the Peace, which was now beginning to be heard in Spain. It says, "We, Carlos Leonardo Luis Manuel de Godoy y Boga, First Minister of His Most Catholic Majesty, Prince of the Peace, Duke of Algucida and Grande of the First Class, Count of Alcudia, Knight of the Most Sacred Order of the Golden Fleece, Knight of the Most Holy Order of Santiago, Knight of the Most Distinguished Order of Calatrava, Captain General of His Most Catholic Majesty's Forces by Land and Sea, Colonel General of the Guardia de Corps, Admiral of the Two Oceans, General of the Cavalry, of the Infantry, and of the Artillery. In any event, sir, it is an order to me to take immediate steps to set you at liberty. I am to restore you under flag of truce to your fellow countrymen, in recognition of your courage and self-sacrifice in saving life at the peril of your own." "Thank you, sir," said Hornblower. And that concludes Mr. Midshipman Hornblower. I just wanted to thank all of you for watching these or listening to these videos for the last 2 years. I apologise for the brief, the 2-year hiatus that took place between my most recent upload and my first upload. There was a new arrival in my household, and let's just say that quiet time isn't quite as frequent as I would like. And I apologise, I do read all of your comments. I don't respond to them, I will admit, failing on my part. But I do read them, the good and the bad, and sometimes the ugly. But I appreciate all the feedback. I'm glad that some of you are enjoying it. I am only a spirited amateur. I'm not a professional reader or voice actor or anything of that description. This is just something I enjoy. I thoroughly enjoy Forester's work, Hornblower and The Age of Sail. So I just wanted to share that with other people. So, thank you all. I don't know if I'll be reading more of these, but I think I might as soon as I can procure. I think the next one is Lieutenant Hornblower. I lent the book to a friend quite a long time ago. I might want to call that particular book back. But thank you all, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to these as much as I have recording them. Yep, so that'll do. I hope you all have a good evening, or morning, or afternoon, whenever you happen to be reading this. Take care, folks.